Hey guys, Dr. Mike Israel here for the last lecture in the Training Principles course, lecture number 9. A lecture to wrap up and get a lot of really good implications from the training principles. Basically, what are we going to do now that we know them? And this lecture is called Principled Thinking. So we're going to talk about a couple of things. One thing we're going to talk about is using the principles as guides versus as strict rules. We're going to talk the difference between creativity and going outside the bounds to make unique training programs that work really well, and concordance, kind of staying within the lines. We're going to talk about how to manage that the best. We're going to talk about how to make use of the principles rankings, because remember, the principles are not equally all the same effect. Some are more important than others. And then we're going to talk about how to evaluate training programs, either ones that you have written, other people have written, in light of the principles. So it's a really good idea to use the principles not so much as rules, which is why they're not called the rules of training, more so as guides, right? If you have a mountain that you want to traverse, a local guide, right, who's been living there for his whole life may be able to, for a fee, take you on the fastest and safest way around the mountain. Can you still get around the mountain by going at it yourself? Yes, you can go the slower way, and that way's not so much wrong, but it might not be as safe or as efficient as the faster way. So if you don't follow the training principles, are you guaranteed to have no success? Well, if the mountain is gnarly enough, if it's super high peak and there's avalanches and there's snow-capped mountain and there's lots of really nasty rock faces and there's landslides and stuff, yeah, you may never actually make it across the mountain if you take a bad enough route. But most routes will have you succeed, just to different degrees. It's going to be less efficient, etc. You still may get to your goal. So for example, if you use the training principles optimally, within a year, you may burn 30 pounds of fat, put on 10 pounds of muscle, and really transform your physique in a visually stunning way. If you don't really concord with the principles, you may get the same results, but it could take you 2 or 3 years. I mean, you'll still get there. Now, if you want to win the Mr. Olympia contest, you may have to use most of the training principles most of the time, because that's that gnarly mountain. Not everybody makes it to the Mr. Olympia contest. Not everybody wins, and you have to do your absolute very best to succeed. So thinking of the principles as guides is probably better than thinking of them as strict rules. Like, if you violate a strict rule, the implication is that you get no success at all. It's simply impossible to do and still succeed. Thinking of them as guides is just better if you use them, and it's much better, and it's so much better that for some goals that are big enough and long-term enough, you may not actually ever reach them unless you use the principles, right? So when we look at each principle, and because it is a guide, there's no such thing really as violating specificity. I've used that term in the past just as a shorthand for the following. We say a term violates, when we say a training practice violates specificity, which means that if we have a spectrum of exactly perfectly concords with specificity and doesn't concord with specificity at all, yeah, only this extreme point really violates specificity. But there's a spectrum there where you do an okay job, or a not-so-great job, and then a better job, and then an excellent job, and then almost a perfect job of the specificity principle. So you don't so much violate specificity in most cases discreetly, but we could look at your training and we say, you know, it could be more specific and thus more beneficial. Training could be more overloading. It could do a better job of overload as opposed to the current job, which isn't that great. So these things are best seen kind of as spectrums as opposed to exact finite yes or no category, right? So you don't really check yes, I hit specificity, or no, I did not. You more or less give yourself kind of like a letter grade, or like a poor attention to specificity, or to, let's say, fatigue management, poor or good or great. And as many greats as you have, the better. But if you have some greats and goods, that's still a good training plan. If everything is poor, it's not going to be a very good training plan. This brings us into our next conversation about what I'd like to call bounded creativity. If you overread the training principles, you may start to think that they're exact rules and that you're basically if you get creative with a training program, you just end up making the program worse. That the only kind of programs that work are robotic programs that are exactly aligned to the principles. Well, an interesting analogy here is kind of like a cookbook. A cookbook has a variety of recipes based on the principles of, proper cooking and palatability. Can you follow them exactly and get a good result? Yes. Can you make some diversions and get a food that tastes great? Absolutely. Right? If you put a little bit more paprika in, or you do a little less spice, you can tailor the food to your needs, and it's still quite delicious. An interesting example that fits well with exercise and sports science is, if you replace the sugar with Splenda, it could lower the calories a ton and still be super tasty, right? But too much diversion is usually not a good thing. So you want to be creative, but you want to have some boundaries. If you have too much diversion of a recipe, you end up, with ice cream in your broccoli, right? Better way to phrase that would be broccoli in your ice cream. You might want to keep those two things separate. Too much creativity is not so great. If you don't think there's such a thing as too much creativity in cooking, just have your 4-year-old make you his favorite dish, assuming that he doesn't burn the house down. It's not going to be anything that resembles food. It's going to be a pairing of really weird stuff that tastes like crap. So it's a good idea to be creative. Being creative is great, but you have to use the principles to make a soft boundary around that creativity. So you're saying, we got a couple of ways to change things, a couple of ways to do things, but if we move too far outside that central area of principled training, then we'll probably get into things that don't work as well. Remember, it's a soft boundary, because we can't ever say, if you're inside the circle of specificity, you're good. If you're outside, that's it. You're wrong and your training backfires and you blow up in a nuclear explosion. It's a soft boundary, so it's kind of a spectrum. The further you move out, for a while it doesn't make much difference, but if you move out really far, it's kind of a bad deal and it doesn't work so well anymore, right? So you might still get results if you go really far outside the boundary, but it's better that you stay within it and be creative. So being creative is great, but it's a bounded sort of creativity, right? It's like, what makes a birthday party really fun? Could it be a surprise party? Sure. Could you have clowns at your party? Totally. What about if is cake good or are cupcakes good? Well, both cake and cupcakes are within that circle of things that are acceptable at a birthday party. What if we say, okay, we're going to have dirt. We're literally going to eat dirt. And there's going to be no guests, only sad-faced clowns, and there's going to be hundreds of them. Well, now your party is so irregular that it is no longer fun. So while it's good to be creative, it's got to be within what we consider fun. And that circle of what encloses all things that are fun isn't exactly just like, this is fun and anything outside is not. Different strokes for different folks, and also there's kind of a boundary, Is eating dirt not fun? Yeah, almost distinctly for everyone. What about like clean cupcakes, or cupcakes that have really low fat and are mostly artificial sweetener and high protein? Like, a lot of people think they're great, but a lot of people think they're meh. So maybe that's on that borderline, and then definitely super fun, or the real kind of cupcakes, which are also super fattening, right? So if you stick mostly within that central area, you can be very well creative within it. Same with the training principles. How you program overload is totally up to you in the sense that it still works. But as you get a little too creative, start using the Bosu ball over here, right, or plyo jumps instead of squats, for hypertrophy, the level of effect starts to go down. You're being so creative, you're outside of the boundaries of what the principles kind of delineate for us. Now, with that taken in mind, how important is it to concord with the principles? Well, you got to remember the rankings. Specificity is the first and most important training principle, and to reiterate from earlier discussions in the first lecture of why, here's why. Let me describe to you an excellent powerlifting program. It's really hard to do. It gets harder over time. Sweet. It has programmed deloads and light days and active rest phases. Cool. We got overload, we got fatigue management. It makes sure to have a pulsatile training structure. We have SRA. It makes excellent use of variation. It's not always the same stuff. And it attends to individual differences. All of those things, and on average, you run 20 miles a week. By the way, it's a running program. Well, hold on a sec. All the principles were correct, but the only one that was different was specificity. We have a great program designed for marathon running. If we apply it to powerlifting, it's going to be terrible. the worst possible program that could check off all the other principles and still suck. Specificity is the most important principle by far because it literally bounds all of the other ones in. Every other principle has to go back and go, okay, is this training specific to the sport? Yes. Now that it's specific, how are we going to apply variation? How are we going to apply phase potentiation? All right? Specificity is the most important. It always needs to have a good check mark, maybe even a great check mark. Overload and fatigue management have to at least be good in order for a program to work well. If you're not presenting any overload, you're not going to make gains for long. If fatigue management is completely ignored, you're going to fall apart sooner or later, right? The latter principles after those big three, specificity, overload, fatigue management, are hit, are not nearly as important. And you don't have to pay attention a ton to them until and unless you have 2 points cleared. One is that the first three are at least well applied. It's not the best idea to help someone with their SRA if you're not quite sure if their specificity is good, or if you're not quite sure if their overload application is good. You've got to make sure that all the first three are really checked off the list. It's like trying to order dessert before you've chosen your actual meal. Go ahead and order your meal first and then worry about dessert after that. Okay, because they're not going to ship, well, unless you skip the meal, it's not going to work to have, nothing for the first meal and then for dessert. You got to make sure that you first get the big stuff going and do a really good job at it, because that's what's going to change your program the most. That's what's going to make it more or less effective the most. Secondly, when the athletes are no longer ranked beginners is when you can use the more advanced training principles. Why? Because if you try to implement too many of the advanced training principles and be a real big stickler on them, the training for beginners can be burdensomely complicated. For example, if using phase potentiation a ton with beginners, their training will change periodically. They're still learning the ropes. They're still learning how stuff goes at the beginner level, at the fundamental level. If you're altering things too often, for advanced athletes, that might be great, but for beginners, they're still trying to figure out how stuff works. And especially if you're helping beginners learn the training principles so they can build their own programs, just have them make sure to check off specificity, overload, fatigue management. Are you training for what you think you're training? Yes, great. Are you training hard and harder over time? Yes, great. Are you taking breaks every now and again to bring it on fatigue? If the answer is to all three to those is great, then it's going to be several years into training where they need to attend to all those other ones to really start to make further gains. So just to wrap that up, focus on the most important three principles first. Later, as time allows and as the individual becomes more advanced, you can focus to the latter principles if the first ones are still attended to. Now, so anytime you have a program in front of you, whether you wrote it or you're considering using it or something like that, you can go through what's called the principles test to make sure that it's a good program, at least in theory. Here's how you do it. Number one, you write out a list of all the principles. Number one, specificity. Number two, overload. Three, fatigue management, etc., etc., etc. Okay, great. You got that list. You go through the program with that list in front of you, and you rate each concordance of the principle as poor, good, or great, right? So you look at specificity, and you look at the program, and you're like, okay, it's a powerlifting program. It's got a lot of weird bodybuilding stuff in here, a little bit of running too, but it's got plenty of powerlifting stuff. I'm going to call it good. Right? And you just say good or something like that, or, number 2 or 1, 2, 3, something like that. Go through and rate all of them. Point number 3 relates to our last slide that we talked about. You want to make sure that you value the first 3 principles more highly than the others. So then you bold them or make them bigger. If you're doing a point structure, you got to add up more points for those. So every single ranking for the first couple needs to count for more. Every bad ranking count for less or something like that, okay? And then see how the program stacks up to another program you've done before or your average program. An easy way to do this numerically is to go like this. If the program ranks a poor on any principle, you rate it a negative 7. Okay, so a negative 7 for specificity, a 0 if it ranks okay for specificity, and a positive 7 if it ranks great for specificity. Why 7? Because there's 7 training principles. Negative 6 if it's a really crappy overload, 0 if it's okay overload, and plus 6 if it's great overload, and so on and so forth. up until you get individual differences, then it's -1, 0, +1. So you can do a different kind of scaling, but it has to reflect the fact that the more important principles, the first couple, are weighted more heavily than the others. Then you rate each one of those, you circle which point structure you're giving it, you go through and you add up all the points at the end. Your average program, one that's decent, is going to score 0, right? Because everything cancels out, it's got as many negatives as positive, and you're at 0. A program which scores an average negative score, don't do that program. The program sucks, right? In a program that scores an average positive score, you compare it to other programs you've evaluated, which also have positive scores, and pick the one that has the most. So if you're looking at some programs, let's say you've got West Side Template, you've got 531, you've got the Juggernaut Method, and you have some other weird super futuristic program you're looking at. Rank all of them, get the cheat sheet out, rank them all, add up all the points for each one, and see which one scores the most. It'll be, one scores a 15, one other scores a -6, one scores a 2, and one scores a 31. Well, the 31 is probably going to be your program. And if you don't believe that the scores are adding up, look through why you added up all the points. You'll be like, oh, this program really hits the first 3 really well, and it does a good job on the other ones too. Well, clearly it's probably the better program. Now, of course, that's just theoretical. You got to try, use the program, and your application of individual differences is going to be a really big point. What we're getting at here is, once you have done that analysis method, you've answered the question of how well does this program concord to the training principles? Because if you just look, and here's a huge point, if you just look at programs as names, you're off to an unfortunate start. Because you can, and we receive questions like this all the time. I receive them all the time on my Facebook. Hey, what do you think of the this and that program? What do you think of the that and this program? I can give you my thoughts, but really I'm just giving you a load of bullshit, unfortunately. Because I can comprehensively analyze a program, but you have no idea how I did that. The only thing you'll learn is Dr. Mike doesn't like this and that program, but he loves this other program. But names of programs change all the time. There's a new program coming out every month with a different name. What are you going to do? Simply send me another Facebook message and say, hey, what about this one? What about that one? What if I don't respond? What if I'm super busy? What if I drop off the face of the earth? What if you're a personal trainer, you have your own clients to attend to, and you need answers quick? You need good answers. That's how come a principled evaluation of a program makes you not have to ask what it's called at all. I can evaluate a program without knowing its name whatsoever. As a matter of fact, I don't want to know its name. It's irrelevant. Programs should be judged based on their criteria of how well do they concord to the principles. If it's a good program, I don't care what it's called. I don't care if my mortal enemy wrote it. It's a damn good program. That makes sense? So we've got to make sure we stay objective, and at the same time use this to evaluate our own programs and say, you can write your own program and then go back and try to rate it, or have one of your friends who's also educated in this stuff rate your program. And he goes, man, your program really not that great because you screwed up specificity. And you look at it and you're like, yep, sure did. That sucks. Let me go back to square one. You can do this for your own programs. You can do this other people, programs that they write. And if you're looking for a program to do, which means either designing your own or purchasing another, your evaluation of multiple competitor programs can come back. And based on principal application, which one does better? Awesome. The reason the numerical way is good is just because getting feelings for programs can, if a program really screws up phase potentiation and you really hate it because you really like phase potentiation, but it does such a much better job at everything else than another program that you kind of like, maybe it's by an author you really like, you kind of get a feel that this one program is great and the other one sucks, but their feelings aren't accurate. Turns out one scores a 40 and the other one scores, a +5. Man, the 40 is probably better, even though you're like, but it really screws up phase potentiation. Well, here you go. Here's our last little option. So 3 options. You can accept the program as is and run it. You can reject the program and choose another, or better yet, you can take a program, whether it's yours or someone else's, modify it in the areas in which it's deficient. Let's say it screws up phase potentiation a lot. Fix that. Fix the phase potentiation. Don't muck with anything else. Make sure everything else is still good, and then you have a new and improved, better program. Folks, that's all I have for today. See you later in the more advanced courses where we're going to be taking these training principles and deriving recommendations for specific sports and applications. We're going to have some about tactical training. We're going to have some about strength and power sport, strongman, powerlifting, bodybuilding, endurance sport, etc., etc., etc. Folks, take care and we'll see you next time.